Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be getting started shortly. Please feel free to take a moment to introduce yourself and share your preferred pronouns in the chat box. Okay, well, the time is now 2 o'clock, so I am going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Clark. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am the operations coordinator with the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Before we get started, I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items for interacting in today's webinar. We are going to keep all participants muted, but we do encourage you to use the chat box for any questions or comments that you might have today. You do have the option of sharing your comments publicly by sharing it in the to line to all panelists and attendees. Or if you would like your comments or questions to be read out anonymously, you can select to send them just to all panelists. We do have captioning for today's session. You should see a CC button in your toolbar to turn those on for today. We are recording today, and a link to this recording as well as materials should be shared with you in the next few days. There is also a link in the chat box to materials and a copy of the presentation for today. With that, I will hand it over to Lorian Castell.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for all of the logistics and for coordinating all of our webinars so well. So my name is Lorian Castell. I am the Director of Prevention at the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I am really happy to be able to convene the conversation that we're going to have today. This is our second webinar that's sort of honoring and acknowledging Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month. And this webinar really focuses on what we can be doing to create and sustain affirming spaces for LGBTQ+ youth. And you know, with Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, which has been a month for a little over 10 years, but we only had a week at one point. Imagine cramming everything that we wanted to do to engage youth and parents and schools and coaches and all of the other people who care about young people, cramming all of that into a week. So, but even in a month, it's sort of challenging to put all of our favorite strategies in place in just 1 month. So I posit that Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month should be, all year, every month. But we all share some strategies and innovative prevention activities that people are doing to engage a variety of people, not just youth, but the people who have influence over them. And what we know is that from LGBTQ+ youth themselves is that they don't always see themselves reflected in the curricula that we are implementing. They don't always see themselves reflected in the programming that we do. And so this conversation is really born out of our understanding and our acknowledgement that we all need to be doing better. We need to be doing better, not just in terms of what we're implementing, but also listening to youth and making sure that we're not anticipating their needs, but that we're providing and responding to their stated needs based on their lived experience. So, and it's not just about schools, it's what's happening in community, it's what's happening in their families, it's what's happening in their, friendship and peer circles, and all of the ways that we can be supporting them in that. So that's the goal of today's discussion. It's very exciting for me to highlight some strategies for being an adult who is supportive, but also strategies for engaging other adults who have young people in their sphere of influence. And we know that our primary audience is often prevention educators in domestic violence and sexual assault programs. And we know that you're engaging schools and you're engaging parents and coaches and folks in your community, folks in the workplace all the time. So we have some things that we'll be talking to you about today. I want to get to our featured speakers who we've really brought together some stellar and very experienced folks to talk to us today. But I just wanted to lay a little bit of groundwork, and and then we'll introduce our featured speakers. And I do want to address just a couple of things. So GLSEN every couple of years does a school climate survey, and we're going to send you all of these resources so that you can see the infographic yourself and what the school climate survey from 2019 says. But this is really daunting stuff. I'm not a big statistics person. I'm a big fan of thinking that if something bad is happening to one person is too many. But when you look at the daunting statistics, the rate of violence that is perpetrated against LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ adults, all across the country, it's sort of a call to action for me. So I just wanted to share a few things that in this last survey, most students in New York have experienced victimization based on their status at school. The vast majority have reported that they often hear anti-LGBTQ remarks, and some of them are from teachers and school staff. They also experienced victimization at school based on disability, race and ethnicity, and religion. And many of them are afraid of being re-victimized, and so they don't report it to school staff so that something can be done about that. And so that's something that we really need to be thinking about as well. Now, the last thing that I just want to point out is that when they do report it, 36%, and this is just in New York, say that nothing was really done or nothing appropriate was done. And so for me, this is a call to action in terms of really getting the schools to understand the importance of making their schools inclusive, accessible, safe, because we know what it does to young people in terms of when they're not feeling well and they're not feeling safe. It affects everything in their lives. It affects their ability to show up to school. It affects their academics. It affects all of their relationships. So there's a way to sort of engage with schools in that manner. Other studies show, and this is from the Urban Justice Resource, this is from the Policy Center, that 24% of youth reported who have reported only having same-sex romantic or sexual relationships either experience psychological abuse or actual physical dating violence. And so I'm not going to read all of these to you, but you'll see that the statistics are really over the top in terms of LGBTQ youth reporting victimization, cyber dating abuse, physical dating violence, and I'm just putting compared to their cisgender, heterosexual compatriots, psychological abuse, and also sexual coercion, which is almost double of heterosexual and cisgender youth. So these, again, the numbers are daunting. The numbers shouldn't matter to us, but it's a way to leverage community-based settings and schools to do better. And then finally, I just want to talk about transgender youth. So because we know that transgender youth in particular are vulnerable to violence in the community, at home, and also in school, and they report the highest rates: physical dating violence, psychological violence and abuse, cyber dating abuse, and sexual coercion. Look at those numbers. So we need to be concerned, and we need to step up and be doing something. I don't want to talk too much. Like I said, I don't think that the stats are the thing that we want to talk about. We really want to talk about this sort of humanity that we want to bring to our interactions and how we can be of service and support. But I also just want to remind people that even those statistics are through the roof, that we also know overall that these things are underreported because of the fear of retaliation, because a lot of young people think nobody knows what to do for me anyway, or they've already reached out to people for support and help and not gotten what they needed. So the fear of being re-victimized, and also the fact that a lot of policies aren't in place to respond appropriately when incidents happen. So that's really the last thing that I wanted to say before we sort of move on. We will send you some infographics. We will send you some research and reports. As always, we'll be sending handouts and links to resources based on where our conversation goes. So I'm really interested in that. And I feel like I've already spoken too long, and I want to hand it over to our fabulous panelists who have carved out some time today to be with us. And I really will let everybody sort of introduce themselves. I believe you have their bios. So I want to introduce Max, who is the public policy coordinator for GLSEN of the Lower Hudson Valley, who will be sort of starting us off today. James Young, who is a longtime colleague, who is a program director for Query, and Rafi Rios from the Anti-Violence Project in New York. And we all know that the Anti-Violence Project in New York City serves New York City, but the whole state, and does a lot of technical assistance and coaching all around the country. And so everybody brings sort of this wealth of experience in terms of what they're going to be sharing with us today. And I'm so grateful for them for being here, but I will let them introduce themselves for themselves and sort of talk about who they are and what they do and what brings them to the work. So before their presentations, I'm going to ask them in turn to say a little bit about themselves. So Max, do you want to do that? Start us off?
Yes, absolutely. My name is Max McCalla. My pronouns are they, he, she. I am proudly one big Q in LGBTQ. I'm queer in sexual orientation, and I'm genderqueer. I'm the public policy coordinator with GLSEN Lower Hudson Valley. We serve Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam counties, and it's a little over 100 school districts. I mainly do the political and governmental work, the advocacy that comes with legislative priorities that concern directly queer youth, as well as indirect matters that still affect the queer community at large. I am on the advisory council with Equality New York, and I'm also on the advisory council with Query, James' amazing organization. And when I'm not doing my nonpartisan nonprofit work, I am a progressive activist, and I work towards advancing those holistic, comprehensive policies forward that benefit all of our marginalized communities.
Thank you, Max. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
James, how about you? Say a few words about yourself.
Hey, y'all. Good afternoon. So glad to be here with y'all. And thank you, Max and Lauren and Jennifer and Rafi. It's nice to share space with y'all. My main job, let's start with my pronouns. So my pronouns are they and he. I am a cisgender, bisexual man, and I am a program director at Query, which is a volunteer position, and Query is near and dear to my heart. I'll talk about that a little bit more later in this session, but I'm also a social sciences professor in a small college in the Bronx. And before that, coming to this work, I worked as at Rockland Family Shelter, which is now known as Center for Safety and Change, which is a domestic violence shelter. I worked there as an educator, going into high schools, teaching about consent and whatnot, as many of you probably are doing. So thank you for being here and taking time to be here. I can't imagine how you're doing that during the age of COVID. And I also worked for Candle, which is in Rockland County, and we did Common Threads, which was the youth empowerment retreat that a lot of young folks called it gay camp for some reason. They liked that instead. So I did that for many years. And before that, when I was 17, I used to be a teen myself, in case you didn't know that. When I was 17, I started Open Doors, which is now called Center Lane. It's the LGBT youth group in Westchester County.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Rafi, if you'd like to introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? Awesome. Hi, everyone. So my name is Rafi. I use they, them pronouns. I am Senior Client Advocacy Specialist with the New York City Anti-Violence Project. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but for now, I have a personal and professional passion when it comes to working with and uplifting LGBTQ youth. And most of my work centers around highlighting the intersections of gender and racial justice in the work that we're doing with supporting LGBTQ plus youth. And one way that we do that at AVP is I facilitate a youth group every Monday virtually now, right? In partnership with Montefiore's Umbrella Program in the Bronx. I'm also a part of the um, Interagency Community Council, which operates under the Department of Youth and Community Development in NYC, which helps me be a liaison for AVP's programs and services with other organizations that serve our youth throughout New York City and beyond, connecting them to our work, our data that we get through our 24-hour crisis hotline, and the narratives that we are receiving from our youth and community members so that we're making sure that we're skill sharing and finding new ways to explore safer spaces for our youth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here today. That all sounds great. So I am going to hand this over to Max to talk a little bit about their work in terms of activism and policy priorities. I do want to encourage everybody to use, because this is a webinar format and not a meeting, we're really inviting people to use the chat and the Q&A function for comments, observations, questions that you might have. And Jennifer and I will be moderating that, and we'll be sort of synthesizing what those questions are or comments and bringing them back to the panelists in case there's a question that is really fitting for one of the panelists or all of the panelists to answer. So please, I'm encouraging you to do that. Have an active conversation in the chat. And without further ado, Max, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Well, before anything, I want to say thank you, Lorian, for really addressing and diving into the GLSEN climate survey results, specifically for New York State. You know, I appreciate it. Though we're making progress nationally in terms of destigmatizing, socially speaking, LGBTQ lives and issues, these results really show that even in a state like New York, we have to focus on our local communities. You know, it's not uncommon to have one school district in one county be dramatically different in terms of LGBTQ issues with another district in a neighboring county. I can even say it's not uncommon to experience that dramatic difference of school districts right next to each other within one county. So I appreciate you bringing forward those results for New York State. So yeah, my name is Max, they, he, she, like I said. I'm gonna be intertwining a little bit my work with as an activist as well as my work with GLSEN specifically and how that relationship works within each other. So yes, can we go to the next slide? Perfect. So actually, before anything, I would like to just run down and show you the different, there's way more than these, of course, but just specifically the kind of the pride flags that we have. So the first, if we're starting top left, just the most updated version of the pride flag. It's called the Progress Pride Flag. It's by Daniel, the artist is Daniel Quasar. Apologize if I'm butchering their last name, Quasar. And it just represents, you know, our current moment of addressing, you see with the pink and the blue, our transgender community, as well as the brown and the black, represents our brown and black communities, that intersection within the queer community, and making sure that we're really taking into consideration all of the identities and the issues of our community. Below that is the bisexual pride flag. Under that is the lesbian pride flag. The next is the pansexual pride flag. Bottom left corner, the intersex community. Now going right is the non-binary community. After that, it cuts off a little bit. I don't see the last color. I believe it's, I can't, sorry, the screen a little bit shows like where my chat bar is, it cuts off, but I don't know the order, but it's, I believe the last one is the agender pride flag. And then the next, I believe, is the asexual pride flag. And then, oh, that's the genderqueer pride flag, which I'm a part of. And the reason I say that is just, you know, if you don't know those different communities, I'm going to share my contact at the end. I'm here to provide all information needed, but I also just recommend it's a Google search. If you don't know what intersex means, if you don't know what pansexual means, these are intermarginalized. Thank you, James. These are intermarginalized groups within the queer community. So I just wanted to bring acknowledgement to them. And also that these flags have different variations, which is really, I mean, this layered difference within the community also just brings forward the need to emphasize that sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, even sex assigned at birth is a spectrum. And just bringing forward all the diversity of our community. So with that, so I'm going to start macro. I'm just talking about what I personally am putting focus into as an activist, and then I'm going to take the issues from there and specifically what I brought with my activism work to GLSEN to focus on specifically queer issues. So the first is specific provisions regarding, you know, mental health service accessibility and resource funding. This was a worsening crisis before the pandemic, which has only gotten worse for queer youth. So we're really looking at what types of policies, bills can we pass forward that aren't just, right now we're noticing a funding issue, but even if it was vice versa, and saying the funds were there, we want to make sure that this is being executed properly. You know, like this isn't just here's funds and then people who have no connection with the community are then figuring out how those funds are going to be distributed. We want to make sure that we are focusing on the communities that need this desperately, not just the queer community as a whole, but the communities within so. The second would be across the board queer inclusion in K through 12 curriculum, especially with middle schools and high schools. This includes sex ed, history, even English. A lot of people find it hard to believe that there are still books banned that involve queer relationships or even just mentioning queer identities. And it's still going on. It's still very common, just doesn't have enough tension. So we want to bring that forward and showing the queer accomplishments that have been made in history, for example, proper sex ed that isn't heteronormative, and also just queer literary contributions and, you know, showing those life experiences. The third is validating, uplifting, and protecting sex workers and their rights. When we talk about, for example, the alarming rate at which transgender people are being murdered, you know, that number almost doubled from 2019 to 2020. Those were Black trans women, and a lot of them were sex workers. So we need to understand that this isn't just about, which I'm supporting decrim, which is going to decriminalize sex work and also work on, I don't know the legal terminology, but essentially making sure that the past criminal, any criminalization of sex workers' work is doesn't affect them going forward. But also, this is a safety net. This is a life-saving issue. So when we talk about this, this is not just a talking about sex work. This is talking about the marginalized lives affected by this directly that are violently policed. And then the last, I just wanted to add in there, passing intersectional progressive policy. The New York Health Act, taxing the ultra wealthy, campaign finance reform, even environmental initiatives. These are all directly queer rights issues. Something I say often is queer rights are human rights, but queer policy is progressive policy. I say this not just as my opinion, but the statistical supermajority of LGBTQ voters in this nation support progressive policies like this. On the state level, this, for example, would be the New York Health Act. On the national level, over 70% of queer people support Medicare for all because they understand that healthcare is a human right. And we need this. So then I had to make the decision because GLSEN is it's a nonprofit organization. It's nonpartisan because of so. So I said, what 2 issues can I bring forward to the board for them to approve? And then we're going to continue our advocacy on that level and use GLSEN resources for. And those would be the top 2 that I listed with mental health, accessibility and resource funding, and queer inclusion in K through 12 curriculum. If we could go to the next slide. So the first bill that we are giving attention to, both individually and with GLSEN, is the LGBTQ curriculum bill. It's from State Senator Jackson and Assemblymember O'Donnell. It is an education mandate that would include LGBTQ accomplishments throughout history into social studies and history classes throughout New York State. This is both public schools and charter schools. There was a bill, it was the Teach LGBT New York bill. It was from Senator Hoylman. We chose this bill specifically just because it is more comprehensive, but you'll see on the next slide when I'm done with this one that we are supporting another bill from Hoylman. And we have me and the executive director of Equality New York have gone in and made further edits with this bill as well. So the current aim is to include historical context events of LGBTQ people in general, but also just the occurrences that occur within the community. We want to talk about queer inclusion in racial justice movements and socioeconomic movements and gender movements, things like that. But at the same time, want to make people aware, like, for example, drag culture is not just an entertainment thing, the history of that. Where does that come from? Why is it so important to us? Things of that nature. And I just wanted to include at the end, education is the first line of defense against ignorance. This was a line on the platform for Skylar Johnson, who ran recently as a 19-year-old for the state Senate. And he just had an amazing platform and had one of the most comprehensive LGBTQ platforms I had seen across the board on anyone's any candidate's campaign that I have seen before. And I can't agree with this statement even more. And they placed 3rd out of 4th, which is amazing for a 19-year-old. So the next bill is the Student Suicide Prevention Act from State Senator Hoylman and Assemblymember Lentil. This requires school districts to produce policies, procedures, guidelines, directing educators specifically on how to respond to students with suicidal thoughts and or ideation. It's already been proven that the first point of contact for queer students or just students in general in regards to addressing their suicidal thoughts, sharing thoughts of suicidal ideation have been an educator. So we want to properly equip educators with how to approach these issues and give them the resources that they need. It is no coincidence that this is specifically a queer issue. As we saw in the beginning, the rates of the harassment, discrimination only lead to high rates of suicidal thoughts, self-harm, ideation with queer youth, and intersecting identities as well. It's even higher. So considering all of this, the last bill, this bill, I want to bring forward just stressing the intersectionality of it, and also that we want educators to be involved with this as much as possible. We don't want this to be a governmental mandate and then say you're on your own. Just like we're engaging all communities within the LGBTQ community in forming policies that represent their needs, we want teachers, educators to be involved in this process as well, so they can feel confident that they can implement the curriculum as well as carry out these suicide prevention measures. And also, I wonder if I have let's see, I'm gonna share the, well, actually, my contact information is at the end, but also it's just a simple Google lookup. If you want to look up any New York State legislative bill, you can literally just type in New York State Assembly bill lookup or New York State Senate bill lookup, and it'll provide you a link where you can look for, even based on topic, particular types of bills that are currently in session or being debated or sitting in committee, so you can learn more. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. Oh, there's a slide with my contact information, I believe.
Contact is at the end now, sorry.
Oh, good. So anyway, you'll see at the end my contact information. It'll have my my email, my personal email, which please, anything regarding LGBTQ politics, things like that, please, if you want to figure out ways that you can get engaged, please let me know. I would love to provide any resources, material that you'll need. You'll also see my GLSEN email as well as the GLSEN website that you can look up and see the things that we're doing. Anything regarding GLSEN material that you need, you can email my GLSEN email. So thank you very much. And also equalitynewyork.org.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? I stopped sharing my video so that I would not be distracting, and now I can't get back on. So that's, I thought I was so tech savvy earlier today, and I've been proven wrong by the universe. Max, thank you so much for all of that. And I appreciate you sharing the legislative priorities. James was adding some things in the chat box that people can look up while you were talking. So thank you, James, for doing that. And any questions? The chat is a little bit quiet right now. So chats or questions, observations, anything you want to put in there, just a reminder to please do that. And I'm going to turn it over to James Young from Query, who will be presenting next.
Thanks so much. Can you give me a time to end?
Yes, I'm going to, yes, I will. I'm going to put it, I'm going to put a timer on and put it in the chat.
Thanks.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you, Max, for all that great detailed information. That's the stuff that I'm always learning more about and trying to figure out how to be better about that stuff. So I'm glad to hear all that stuff of where to go look for information and how to be more involved. So my name is James. I use he, him, they, them pronouns. And the only thing I'm going to share on this page is you can follow us on Instagram on those links, query.us, query challenge, pronoun challenge and queer mark, and we'll talk about all of that. What I'm going to do for you today is explain to you what query is and what we do, and maybe you might glean from it, especially if you're educators working with young folks. Maybe you'll get some ideas from this that might go, "Ooh, we can try to do something like that." And so that's the hope. Before I move on, though, can we just take a breath? Really? I mean, really? Yeah. Let's take a breath together. Ready? Hmm. You know, that was so nice. Let's take another one. So I love being able to do that with folks. It's so important, along with sharing pronouns and all the other stuff. Because I feel like, we're all so stressed lately, right? With COVID and then the snowstorms, and like there's so much going on constantly. And then we've got to roll up our sleeves and get to this work. So just remember to take some breaths, right? Do some self-care in between too. Okay, the first thing I want you to look at, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, is if you look at our name, Query, it means the name came from queer theory. We're combining queer theory and we're bringing that, making it fun. And the next thing I want you to notice is that look at the Q. Can you look at the Q and take and put your head to the left? So put your left ear onto your left shoulder, and you'll see the Q turns into a. You can put in the chat if you want. What does it turn into? The Q turns into a blank. Go ahead and put that in. I see some smiles from our panelists. Yeah, it turns into a question mark. And we believe that if we ask enough questions, maybe we can live more authentically, right? Because so that's kind of what we do. And we're interactive. So I'm going to take you on a journey of query. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to do what I can to get this all in within a certain amount of time. All right. So again, we're query. You can follow us. We try to make queer theory accessible and fun because we realize not everyone who goes to college can take queer theory. I know I didn't. Did you? I didn't get that chance. And not everyone gets to go to college either, right? Thank you so much, Lauren. And we are considered an art-based primary violence prevention education organization. So we want to work with as many people to talk about these things. And we use art because we find it's a little more fun sometimes. And through asking questions, we can find our most authentic selves. Please move on. Well, thanks, Matt, for putting your information there. Please, people, copy and paste that for yourself. Max is a great person to be in touch with. All right, so our first project was called Sticks and Stones, and we took words that were used against LGBTQ folks or used words that were used within the community, and we looked at the impact of these derogatory terms within and against our communities to stimulate discussion. Now, you might be looking at this going, what are you talking about? Well, I'll help you out. You ready? Please do not write this in the chat. We're not looking to use these terms. I'm just trying to have a conversation with you, and you might have this moment, okay? So be careful, these are triggering, yeah? So if you look at the top left corner, there's the red one that looks like a house. We call it home. It's a term that we use a lot with young male-assigned children to control their behavior. We try to control behaviors of boys by calling them these words. Can everyone put that together? Don't put it in the chat. You don't even have to say it, but it's home plus the letter O, right? So these rebuses, once you start realizing what they are, it takes you on this interesting journey of like, oh, that's an interesting word. And so that's what we did. And we were talking about how this trauma happens, this verbal trauma happens all the time. Now, as an Asian person of color, I got to talk to my parents about what it felt like talking about Asianness, right? And being called names, making fun of my eyes and all that stuff. But I'm not sure how many queer kids get to talk to their parents about these things, right? Especially if they're not out. And what we have found is this can be very fun, although triggering to talk about for young folks. We've done mostly college and up to share this information. We have done a few high school programs as well. And so anyway, so that's one of our programs. We were doing these live, and then we started connecting with Niskative, and that's the next page. With Niskative, we took these derogatory terms and we took like the four basic ones that people are called, and we created this poster calling Sticks and Stones may break your bones, but words can hurt too. We're highlighting two things in this. We're highlighting that verbal abuse is also abuse, which isn't always translated when we talk about domestic violence. And I know you know that, right? A lot of times we think physical abuse. So we wanted to demystify that. And we also wanted to highlight that it also happens in LGBTQ plus communities. And a lot of times people may not be aware of that. And so imagine, like, the idea behind this was, imagine going to a DV shelter or somewhere and you see this hanging, if you're a queer person, immediately you see the rainbow and it's like, oh yeah, like these are my people. I can share my story. I'm not going to be asked, you know, if I'm masculine, I'm not going to be asked about my wife, or right. It's not going to be assumed my gender, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's this idea of having these cues that allows people to feel a little safer, more welcomed. Did you know that people who are part of minoritized communities like LGBTQ folks have an expectation of rejection? Are you familiar with that? We have an expectation of rejection. So we carry this walking into the room expecting to be rejected. But when we see signs like this, we're like, oh, we might be okay here. Yeah. And so that's part of this project, and to get people talking about it. All right. So then thank you so much for showing this. Next slide, please. I'm hoping you're enjoying this. So then the pandemic happened and people were stressed out. So we started doing queer Zen meditation. We did this with the Loft LGBT Community Center in White Plains. We hosted on Zoom. We still meet every day, every Thursday at 5:30. Come join us if you want. But this is a collaboration to actually help people just to kind of get centered a little bit, and also get centered in queer specific space, right? So someone might come in and feel a little more accepted without even having to look for signs. They just know that this is going to be a place I belong. And isn't that what we all want and need? So you might notice the logo is the Enzo circle, as well as the lotus flower, as well as the progress rainbow colors. Again, the point is to try to make it as comfortable as possible when we first get there. And so people can then really show themselves, right? Because part of being a minoritized community is like, is it okay to say something? Is it okay to be really here? And so that's part of the work that we're doing. We also do a live Instagram meditation at 9:30 on Saturdays if you want to join us at Queer Zen Meditation. The next thing we started doing was we created these Pride Zoom backgrounds, which I couldn't get on my computer because my background is too busy. But I love, Rafi, that you have your own Pride Zoom background. That's awesome. And so if you go to our website, query.us, you will find under projects tons of these backgrounds. This one's of New York City. There's a butterfly one. My son is there, Blair, with his butterfly background. We have tons of different ones. There's Fire Island. There's so the idea was on Zoom, you could still put this out there as an educator, as someone who's in charge of a group, running a group, right? Wouldn't it be fun to see these colors, you know, to show up and be like, yes, this is part of my group, even if it's not a queer space, right? It's kind of like we're seeping in, right? Like we're gonna have queer spaces everywhere, right? So that people can feel safe or safer. Next slide, please. And the next one is, so this is, so we started playing with International Pronouns Day on July 14th last year, and we started playing with this idea of adding pronouns to social media and Zoom accounts and email signatures. And I encourage you to do that. And as a professor at Monroe College, I start all my classes by saying, this is Professor Young. I use he, him, they, them pronouns. I also do introductions with all my students. Some students know about it, some students don't, then they learn, right? And so it becomes the norm that I share and respect my pronouns. That's the point. I share and respect pronouns. Wouldn't it be cool if everyone did that, right? We are currently working with Monroe College to get them to do it across the board. And we've been working with Westchester County government as well to do that as well. So we also have this nice little doc that shows you can, if you get confused in navigating pronouns, offer your pronouns, ask for their pronouns, and then respect pronouns. So it just gives you little tips. I think people like that kind of stuff. They need little tips like that. Next slide, please. I'm zooming through this. I'm hoping you're getting some good ideas. Now, our last major project was we created a card company. So we noticed that Hallmark doesn't do a lot of queer cards. So we created Queer Mark cards to create queer-centric greeting cards to celebrate queerness. And our first card was a thank you for coming out card. You know, National Coming Out Day, for those of you who don't know, we ask people to come out. But why are we asking queer folks to do more? I'm just saying, right? Why don't we thank them for coming out? Like, thank you for coming out over and over and over again. So that's our project, and these cards are still available, but we didn't stop there. What we offered during the holiday season, the winter holiday season, was we offered a queer card that looked a little more like this, like a standard holiday card. And then we said that was too generic. So we literally created a generic card. And you can see the rainbow stitching in the word generic. And the idea behind this was to think about family of choice. Again, we highlight queer theories. So we're going to talk about family of choice. And when we're thinking about the holidays and family of choice, we realize that not everyone has family if you're a queer person, right? Sometimes you're not even, you may, some queer folks may be kicked out of their homes. And so we teamed up with Ali Forney, which is a homeless shelter in New York City. 40% of homeless youth in New York City identify in the LGBTQ spectrum. So like it's disproportionate, right? So with these cards, we actually started doing this new idea, not just creating cards, but we wanted to highlight Ali Forney, talked all about them, and also raise funds using these cards. And I think we gave them over $1,200 from people who supported it to help with their program. So that's what this card company is now doing, right? We raise awareness about something and create money. And our last endeavor was our Valentine's Many Forms of Love card. We use these candy hearts, progress rainbow colors, and in it, it says stuff like, be proud, be brave, be kind, be queer, what? And we figured anybody can get these cards, right? And again, we connected with the Loft LGBT Center. They have a program called Transmission, and if you're not aware, now you know. Transmission offers funding to cover gender affirming costs for people who can't afford that. And so so far we've raised $750. We're hoping to raise more. So if you want to give us money, we're happy to transfer it there. But that's the idea, is to create projects that create meaning, create learning, change of attitude, and also how fun is it to cultivate love and send someone an actual card, especially in a digital world today. You know, we're all screen tired, fatigued. Please, next slide. Thank you. Ooh, I got 2 minutes. Let's see what we can do. Okay, so long story short, Dorothy Riddle, if you don't know her, Dorothy Riddle was the person that was on a committee that helped get homosexuality out of the DSM, so to make it not a mental health disorder, right? She also created this thing called the Riddle Scale. And so if you take a look at this for a second, you see there's homophobic levels of attitude. And you know how most people are like, oh, we're looking for tolerance and acceptance. But if you look at this chart, queer theory is going to tell you that's not enough. That's actually on the homophobic level. What we really want is support, admiration, appreciation, and then even at the highest level, nurturance. And so that's what a lot of these projects are doing. And I'm hoping that this riddle skill makes sense to you, and that you might look at your own projects and what you do with young folks, specifically queer folks, and where are you doing your work, right? Are you doing it at the acceptance level, or are you doing it at the support level, admiration level? Think about this thank you for coming out card, right? We're really saying that we admire, right? And that we appreciate what you do by coming out. All right. One more slide, I think. Oh, 2 more slides probably. So the next one was we took this riddle scale and we changed it and we added looking at BIPOC folks as well, right? So looking at that it's not just LGBTQ folks, right? That we looked at it as it's discrimination on many levels. So if you look at racial differences, right? Are we accepting of Black folks? Are we accepting of Asians? Like that's that's not enough, right? Like we wanted to say that the riddle scale can be used on all levels of advocacy and to show support to folks, that we don't want to just look at acceptance and tolerance. And so our team, our query team, because we like art, we created this hourglass to show that. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so this went along with our thank you for coming out card. We gave specific steps of what people can do, create a list of queer folks that you know, reach out to them if it's safe without outing them, and then tell them, you don't have to buy the cards. You can do this on your own. You can tell them on a phone call that you appreciate what it's like to have to come out over and over and over and over again, right? So on and so forth. So our project wasn't just about selling cards. It's really sending this message. Next slide, please. I think I'm almost done. I'm so sorry if I'm going a little over. Oh no, I guess I am done. Look at that. So we are Query, and if you find us on Instagram, you can find us at query.us, Queer Zen Meditation, Query Pronoun Challenge, and Queer Mark Cards. And I want to tell you one more thing. If you go to our website, and I'll put a link in the chat, you can get almost all of these materials that I'm holding in my hands. You get all these materials, right, downloadable from our website, including a miniature version of the domestic violence awareness, or thank you for sharing your pronouns, our riddle scale, and the sticks and stones. So this way you can actually use them yourself in conversations with your teens if you want, if you're working with teens. Thank you so much. That's my time. I appreciate it. I hope you got something out of this.
Thank you. You're done, but you're not done, right? So, we're hopefully we're going to have a good conversation. Um, After Rafi talks about his work at AVP and all of the wonderful work that they do, but also from his own personal perspective. James, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I'm going to move on to this next slide, and Rafi, you're up. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, thank you. Hey everybody. So, whew, I'm already feeling so amped up and excited and energized and inspired after hearing Mac today. So, I really want to keep that momentum going. So I'm not going to talk too much about the vast work that AVP does because I really want to take the time to amplify the narratives and experiences of the LGBTQ plus youth that we work with and that I don't want to say represent, but I um, advocate for on a day-to-day basis by first and foremost acknowledging that I am Rafi, I use they, them, theirs. I've been working with AVP for 5.5 years as a client advocacy specialist, and my platform has been centered around working with LGBTQ survivors of violence under the age of 24. So a lot of my work intersects with youth that have experienced dating violence, tech violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, hate violence, and sometimes an amalgamation of two or more types of violence that they experience. It's also important for me to acknowledge that the work that we do intersects so much with gender equity and racial justice work that we're constantly trying to bring into these spaces when we're talking about how are we creating safer spaces for LGBTQ youth. So a little bit about AVP. We envision a world in which all LGBTQ and HIV affected people are safe, respected, and live free from violence. Our mission is to empower LGBTQ and HIV affected communities and allies to end all forms of violence through organizing and education and support survivors through counseling and advocacy. AVP is nationally recognized as experts on best practices when working with LGBTQ and HIV affected survivors of violence. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to give a quick breakdown of what is it that we're doing, especially now during the ongoing pandemic. I work specifically with the client services department. We operate a 24-hour bilingual hotline. It's our crisis hotline. It's basically the first stop for many folks who are seeking to engage with AVP's programs and services. We provide short-term counseling, advocacy. We support folks with OVS assistance. If you're not aware of that, that's the Office of Victim Services that provides victim compensation for folks who are victims of crimes in New York. We have an economic empowerment program. We provide consultation and safety planning around economic sustainability and provide folks the tools necessary to better equip themselves with navigating housing, shelter advocacy, and public benefits. We also provide accompaniments virtually. So even though because of the pandemic, we're unable to do what we normally would, which is accompany folks to hospitals, courts, precincts, we can still do so virtually by utilizing the tools that we have at our disposal like Zoom and trying to find ways to better case conference to connect with external programs and organizations so that our youth feel a little bit more heard and represented when they're being asked to show up to these spaces for whatever reason. We also have a legal department. Our intakes are open. There's about a 2 to 3 week waiting period to hear back from them. However, you're provided free legal consultation around issues like family law, matrimony, divorce, legal name change, housing matters, support in criminal cases, etc. We it's best practice not to turn anybody away. We engage with a lot of different partner organizations throughout New York City and New York State to make sure that whenever someone comes to us for help, especially LGBTQ youth, it's never a no, but it's a yes, and here are the options that are available to you. We call that option clarification. Because what happens often with youth is that they're usually presented with a barrier, if not an ultimatum. And it's my job as an advocate to say, these are all the options that are available to you. Let's unpack why is it that you may feel like these options are inaccessible to you, or if there are ways that we can get around that, right? And that's important because what we're doing is that we're re-equipping our youth with the agency needed to be able to make their own decisions when they're reclaiming themselves within the narratives as survivors. All right. And that's not just survivors within intimate partner violence, but it's also survivors as Black queer youth, as youth who are disabled, youth who are neurodivergent, and youth who are experiencing, whether it's being runaway homeless youth, whether it's being survivors of the foster care system or the school to prison pipeline. I mean, we could talk about this all day, right? But at the end of the day, anybody who is under the age of 24 who wakes up in the morning and decides to live their truth uninterrupted, that is an act of resilience and an act of revolution. And that's why it's so important for us as older adults and as advocates to be able to uplift their truth and their narratives and make sure that anytime that they encounter a barrier, we're there to uplift that and try to find more equitable ways for them to get access to said services. A lot of that centered all around what is it that we also do with our community organizing department. So I'm going to go ahead and ask us to go over to the next slide. Okay. So my favorite thing about the work I do at AVP is my youth support group. It's something that I inherited when I first started working at AVP, and I looked at the entire curriculum and said, okay, awesome, we got to improve this, right? And I had an amazing support group with my supervisor and my department and the folks at Montefiore's umbrella program, also known as the Adolescent AIDS program. We were able to take time to take a step back from what our usual lesson plans were and what the expectations of the youth group were, and really sit with our youth and ask them, why are you here? What are your hopes for this youth support group? What does safe mean to you when we put on our front door, this is a safe space? What does outreach look like for you? And how can we make this space sustainable enough that it's not only encouraging you to keep coming back, but it's going to incentivize you to want to bring other people as well, right? So I'm glad to say that I've been co-facilitating this group for over 5 years. It's still running strong, even throughout the pandemic. We switched over to Zoom after getting, all the confirmation stuff around it being HIPAA compliant and all that. Um, a lot of the lesson plans that we incorporate into our youth support group is a little bit of each one teach one. And what I mean by that is we'll have an orientation period quarterly, which is a great way to be able to bring in new youth that are interested in the support group. And we'll tell them, these are some topics that we can bring to you every week, right? We can talk about life skills, like what is a stock? What are taxes? Let's talk about alternatives to college. Why is it that college works? What is a grad school? What is an internship? All of these amazing life skills that we can either facilitate ourselves for the youth, or we engage with partner organizations and have experts in the fields come and meet with them. We've even had people come in and teach them about more economic and sustainable ways to cook. Like thinking about what does it mean to live off of top ramen and to like have access to fine fare compared to Gristedes. Then after we lay all of that on the table and let the youth choose, which are the topics that they're most interested in for the next 3 to 6 months, we also ask them what's coming up for them. And you'd be surprised by the things that come up with our youth. You're talking about youth that are most often under the age of 21, right? And even after the fact, they're still bringing up similar situations around, how do I get access to trans affirming medical care? How do I advocate for myself when it's just me and a doctor in the room? Um, how do I get access to binders? How do I navigate my hormone therapy in a home or in a shelter where I may not feel safe being out as trans? How do I navigate being Black during this time? How do I navigate being Black and trans during this time? There's so much that comes out of our lived experiences, our current events that impact how is it that our youth are showing up to these spaces. It might not be the best Monday to talk to them about sexual health and prevention and the importance of access to PrEP and PEP. That's something that we can table for next week, because right now the youth want to talk about why is it that our Capitol building is under attack? What is an insurrection and how does this impact me? And it's important for us to elevate that and to give them that space. And then me as the, quote unquote adult in the room, I still identify as a young adult. What's up? Because, I'm 29, right? Oh shit, I just turned 30. Wow, it's been a Friday. Anyways, that's my truth. That's my age identity. So, it's important for us to create that space for our youth because of the fact that, you know, it is my privilege to not only facilitate the youth group, but also to take what I'm hearing from them, what they're sharing with me, and translate it to our funders and to my supervisor and to the board of my organization and to you all, and basically say there will always be time for us to equip our youth with what are our funding requirements. We're going to connect them to the healthcare navigator. We're going to connect them to the shelter system. We're going to connect them to the life skills workshops and to the HIV and STI screenings and the PrEP coordinator. And we're going to teach them about the IPV power and control wheel. We're going to connect them to Safe Horizon and to all these other extraordinary organizations that are already doing the work. And we need the funding, the sustainability as an organization, and the support from you all to be able to give youth the space to be revolutionary, to give youth the space to be able to say, this is what's going on in my life, and this is how you can all support us. Or these are things that just haven't been working. Do you have other ideas? That gives us, and as advocates, the opportunity to be able to bring this to the table where change happens and be able to make sure that we're bringing our youth with us, right? And that's why it's so important to be able to have these panels and have these conversations and talk about why is it that it's important to have these youth support groups. Because it's not just us providing lessons and life skills and safe spaces for our youth, it's also giving them the safe platform that they need to be revolutionary, to be the next Marsha P. Johnson, to be the next Fred, oh my goodness, Fred Hampton, to be the next, I just have so many names. It's a Friday, but y'all get me. I'm like, let's talk Angela Davis, Asada Shakur, like Oscar Rivera Lopez. The list goes on. Be the next me. Be the next me. Be the next James Young. Be the next Max. Right? Like that's what it's all about. And I think that I say all of that to go full circle and say, AVP has provided me as someone who's a part of this community, who's now a staff person and a manager at that, not only the privilege and the platform needed to be able to keep my community moving forward, but also to be an expressive outlet for that community, for my community, and bring it to these panels and to these platforms and to your organizations so that you know that the work is still happening and our voices are heard and we exist and we're thriving and we want to be there and we want to hear from you. We want your support. So, all that to say, thank you so much for even listening to me today and for listening to us and being a part of this panel. And at the same time, thank you so much for never saying no when a youth is talking. And that includes me and every youth that I brought with me today. Um, Final note on that point, every single day I keep thinking about Abel Cedeno. I keep thinking about how is it that so many different organizations and agencies could have done better to prevent a situation like Abel Cedeno in the Bronx. and how I never want something like that to ever happen in our schools. So I say keep fighting, keep going in the front lines, keep thinking about ways that we can prevent that, and listen to the people who are in the front lines who are actually doing the work to create that change and uplift our queer youth. Thank you.
Thank you. You're amazing. You understood exactly your timing there, as all of you did. Thank you so much. All of that was really inspiring, from all three of you. I really appreciate it. At this time, we have 25 minutes to have a conversation. So I want to invite questions and comments and observations, from our participants. But I also want to invite the panelists. Max, it's been a long time since we've heard from you. So whether or not you had any observations or things that were churning in your brain as you were listening to James or Rafi speaking, anything that you want to sort of add to the conversation?
I want to actually just piggyback off of that idea that Rafi was bringing forward, that I appreciate that every single one of our organizations is not working top down. It is working down up. We are not coming to the table and making decisions based on our opinions. All of us are coming to the table after having those listening sessions, after having those important discussions with educators, youth, everyone involved, where these issues are, the people who are directly affected by these issues. And it seems like such a simple thing, but I would like to see more organizations and more groups run in that type of power system. And I think it's incredibly important. I appreciate everyone here emphasizing that.
Well, it seems like a simple thing, but adultism runs deep. It's actually an ism that I'm not sure we're addressing enough. And so when we talk about listening to survivors and listening to, other people who've been victimized, when we talk about listening, the importance of listening to, immigrants who are facing terrible discrimination in our country right now, all of that seems really obvious. But the adultism that this culture sort of maintains, it gives us sort of an out in terms of listening to young people and not treating young people as fully human, in and of themselves, no matter what age they are. So I really appreciate that. There's much, much more work to do. It's funny, I used to get invited to do trainings around adultism all the time in the beginning of the prevention work, and I haven't been asked to do that in a long time. I think that says something. But thank you, Max. That's very true. I think listening is extremely important. And can I just take this moment, because James, I want to hear from you, but I do want to take a moment to say that we are very committed to creating a youth advisory. But the one thing that we want to do to sort of wrap up Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month and the What is Love contest is to invite every young person who's submitted a piece of artwork to be part of a webinar, a panel discussion like this, to talk about, what resonated for them that made them think about it in the first place and want to, participate in the contest. And hopefully that'll be a really good conversation. And we're designing it as a speak out, so that we're talking right now about what youth need, and I'm really interested in hearing from all three of our panelists about what you needed when you were young, and maybe even what you got when you were young that helped you be who you are, and helped you be your authentic selves. But we really need to hear that from youth. So I'm proud that we can convene a conversation with young people, and particularly people who, when they heard about the contest, they said, yes, I have an idea about that, because those ideas are already churning for them. And to find out, what do they need from us as adults, as parents, as teachers, as coaches, as faith leaders, whatever it might be. Okay, so James, any observations or comment? I do have a few questions from the participants that I will share, but James, just some observations as you listen to the other folks.
You know, it's interesting. So, you know, Query is more like a volunteer organization right now. We don't have staff or anything. We'll get there. But you know, my work mostly is with my students at the college level, and I find that you know, Rafi, what you said about really listening is important, and I think that my students sometimes get a little confused if they're new to me, because they're like, "What do you mean? What do I want?" Right? I ask them to write a paper and I'll give them the guidelines and I'll say, well, what do you want to write about? Right? This is psychology. And they're like, what do you mean? Like, I get to choose, I get to have my own ideas. And I feel like that was not my experience growing up either. And the other piece that I think that I'm so alienated from and isolated from is the larger macro pieces that I think Max brought to the table earlier, and I'm always so lost. Like, and that's why I rely on people like Lorian or Jennifer or Max or other folks to be like, listen, sign this document. You need to sign this document. You need to sign this petition. Did you see the Walking Wild Trans? You know, like I need people to like, here, click this button, do this thing, because I'm never clear on the political side of things and the laws. I'm more of the connection with the students piece. And so I appreciate being able to, in this conversation, have both, to realize there's a connection between the two and to be able to share stuff that I get from others, like, you know, click on this link and then share that with the students that I work with and say, hey, if you're interested in this, here's what's happening and this is what you could do. Because I feel like when I was younger, I didn't get enough of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, I do have a question. Oh, Jennifer's saying voting is now open for the What is Love art contest. And they're on the Niskatives Facebook page, so our organization's Facebook page. And I accidentally loved something yesterday, and I was like, well, now I have to love all of them to make them easy. I didn't mean to weigh in at all. I should have stayed neutral, and I will by loving all of them. So please do that. Max has just shared the all of the organizations, so that's fantastic. I do have a question, Rafi, for you, which is, you know, you talked about AVP and all of the services that you provide, which was, you know, really a fantastic overview. I know you do a lot of technical assistance training and support throughout the state and throughout the country, but are the services available outside of New York City?
Thank you. That's a great question. I want to say yes and. So we provide CTA through the IPV network in New York State. So we provide that technical assistance, and we have historically had trainings requested of us, right, to other organizations and entities outside of New York City. And in a pre-COVID world, we had no problem facilitating that and, you know, traveling to do the work, whatever it takes. And even now, more accessibly, we're able to do that, right? Because it's all Zoom and virtual now. And if there are certain types of services that we have community members who call us and are asking for support around, let's say counseling, maybe advocacy around resources in their neighborhood and stuff, we do what we can within our capacity as a hotline, as you know, folks who are experts doing this work as an organization for over 30 years, right? 40 years now, because we're hitting our anniversary this year. Our greatest strength is our network and our partners. So we're unafraid to say, this is where we've exhausted our options, and we're going to refer you to these 3 local resources or organizations near you that we can you know, see if they have other options for you and what programs and services they provide. And we'll even take the extra step to be able to case conference or you know, just do the work and give a courtesy phone call to other organizations, especially in Hudson Valley. Some of my favorite organizations, I have a bias, but but you know, we'll reach out to them and we'll just be like, hey, we have this youth that call the hotline. They're experiencing dating violence and their abusive partner goes to the same school as them. They're having a difficult time finding a safe space to be able to talk about that because they go to the same school guidance counselor. It feels like it would be more supportive to the youth if they found counseling services near them instead of engaging with us through virtual short-term counseling. What options are available to you, right? And we'll connect them to other organizations who are doing the amazing work and are able to better support the youth. Even giving the youth an opportunity to reach back out to us, let us know if the referral was successful, and that gives us feedback to be able to collect from other partner organizations to know how we can continue having that healthy relationship.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I'm inviting everybody's questions. Please feel free to weigh in the Q&A or the chat. I do have one more question, Rafi, for you and for Max and James as well, which has to do with convening youth and sort of what that looks like, what the best practices are for bringing youth together. Now, Max, I know that GLSEN has access. I mean, it would be interesting to hear from you, the Gay Straight Alliance groups in all of the middle schools and high schools across New York State, sort of what kind of relationship GLSEN has with all of those. And because that's another piece for communities where there isn't a support group like what Rafi is describing. And I'm guessing it's a really big state. I've been doing this a long time. I'm sure that something like that does not exist in many communities, but GSAs do. And so Max, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So just like the rest of the organizations here, we GLSEN, both GLSEN Lower Hudson Valley and GLSEN as a national organization does absolutely so much. That's why I only concentrated on my political work with the chapter, is because I would be fully unable to, and I condense that type of information into this. We do faculty and student presentations on a wide range of any LGBTQ issues, whether it be introductory or something as specific as talking about the intersection of disability and being transgender, which is an actual workshop that we've done before. Also providing educational material and resources. We have essentially, because the bill is still being passed, we have the curriculum that schools can implement into their history classes, into their English classes, into their even, like PE, sex ed type things. So I'm also, I guess the end of my public policy coordinator title is and community liaison, because I want to also be the middle person to have any organization, any individual, just to have that person with the group, with the board, so they know to contact me about anything, because then I can transfer them to the right person if I can't handle it myself. So I guess that would be where me and Rafi, for example, do the same yes and type work. If we personally can't do it, if it's something that's more crisis oriented, we will find the organization that's appropriate to help you. And we are going to follow up with you just as additional support to make sure that you're going along in a healthy manner with the process that they give you.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. That's wonderful. And GSAs can they be sort of school adult generated, or is the preference that they be youth generated?
Yeah, so luckily we have seen in Westchester, Rockland, Putnam, the GSA advisor, the adult, the educator, is just there to facilitate the needs and discussion of the students. So luckily a lot of adultism isn't really occurring in the GSAs, or at least we haven't had any reports of that really. So luckily they're very student oriented, student run. And It's just honestly, in some cases unfortunate, but also amazing just to see the wide range of differences and the needs coming forward from uh, GSAs in northern Westchester with lower Westchester, where northern Westchester is expressing we're good with sexual orientation, but need much more information on gender identity, for example. And then lower Westchester is saying, there is way too much racism going on in our GSA groups. We need help and addressing that and addressing that as well. So it's we work with the needs that are expressed to us. We are fortunate to be an organization that has so much educational material, well beyond the climate survey, because we take the results from the climate survey and then make a multitude of educational material from the results found from those. So we're not just saying, here's the unfortunate reality. We're saying, here's the reality that we are now going to work off of.
Okay, wonderful. And so I want to point out, Jennifer's just put the link to our NISCATIV's online prevention toolkit in the chat box. We work really hard to vet resources from all over the country that we believe are sound, and they go either into our, well, there's lots of buttons, right? But one of them is dismantling oppression. And then there are many around engaging young people, engaging parents, and engaging schools, young people in school-based settings and young people in non-school-based settings. GLSEN is definitely something that we've been highlighting ever since I found out about them. So that is all in there. I urge you to look at those resources. And if there is something that is missing, please let us know. We're very committed to making sure that anything that's in there is relevant and that it is intersectional. So one of the things that Max was just saying reminded me to say this, that we don't want to promote resources that don't have that lens, because sexism and heterosexism and transphobia and homophobia, classism and racism, and all the other isms, ableism, it's really, really all connected. And people, in terms of their status and their positioning in the world, occupy more than one of those spaces in terms of identity. So we're very, very careful to make sure that there's that the resources and the tools, the materials that we promote have that lens. So I invite you to look at that with a critical lens. Let us know what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. Help us add to that and grow it, because we're always trying to drive traffic to that piece. And the other piece is that from our conversation today, we will amass, as I said at the top of our webinar, we will amass some links and some resources, which everybody's been just getting in there too, which is fantastic. We also have a prevention listserv where we're bringing together prevention educators and education coordinators, whatever the title is, for domestic violence and sexual assault programs all across the state. So we have a prevention listserv where information is shared, training opportunities, those kinds of things. So I wonder that I don't see, Jennifer, can you help me? Are there any other questions in there that I've been missing? Jennifer's just posted, if you want to sign up for the listserv, that's the link that you can use. Thank you, Jennifer. James, please.
Yeah, so, I so appreciate having the opportunity to work with y'all. It's really a pleasure to be able to think more about this and on different levels as well. And, in the book club that I'm part of, QCBC, we talked about rainbow washing last time, which is, putting rainbows on and putting pronouns and things. And, it's complex because, if you're not really doing the work underneath it, then it doesn't mean anything, right? Like, when Chase throws on a rainbow, or I don't know, Chick-fil-A would ever do that. But like if you have places that do really horrible things, but they throw on a rainbow, so what's the big deal? But I feel like for me, as a young person, when I was 16, 17, I was living on my own. and I started going to a men's group. There was no youth group. There weren't GSAs or QSAs at the time. I'm 46 now. And so I went to this men's group, and it was strange to be the kid, right, in a room with all these grown adults, like 30, 40, 50, 60-year-olds. And what I found was very helpful was it felt like it was a place to belong. And I felt like the reason why I started that youth group wasn't because it was what I wanted necessarily. It was because one of the elders, my gay elders, came over and said, "Hey, why don't you do this? What do you think about this?" And I think, the idea you all talked about, like GSAs, QSAs, sometimes it's student led. I think also sometimes it's about creating the space too. It's not just one, right? It's not just one answer. It's a little bit of both. Sometimes it's about creating the space so then people show up and then do the work. And for some GSAs or QSAs, it's really not about activism. It's about support, right? Like each GSA or QSA might be different. But I would say for folks, especially if people are posting, I've noticed that people are posting your names are great in there. And I would recommend, again, to consider putting your names in the Zoom account like we have. You just click the 3 dots. It just immediately makes, like when I see that, I'm immediately feeling, oh, I can take that breath. And when I was a kid, I remember seeing like rainbow stickers on cars and the HRC equality logos sticker. Do you know what I'm talking about? For those of you who are queer, I don't know if you had the same feeling, but it just made me feel like, oh, gay card, gay card. Like it just made me feel a little happier. And there's a term in the trans community, we might diagnose someone trans with gender dysphoria, but there's a term that's gender euphoria, right? Which we don't talk about. And it's that feeling of happiness and joy when you feel like, yes, this is part of my group, I belong, and I'm full, I'm joy, right? And we need to I highlight that part of the life, right? And I think if we do pronouns, I know it's maybe, maybe I started doing pronouns before I even knew what pronouns were all about. And then I got deeper into the work. And so I feel like this part of the rainbow washing is important, right? It's part of the process for some of us. And so I encourage you to do that. You can also use the riddle scale that I offered earlier and just go, are we accepting and tolerating? Or are we doing a little more than that? That's what I would add. And I think that made a huge difference to me, just to see I don't know, I still see rainbows and I'm like, yay, it's queer space. And I think I may be different than what teens are experiencing today, but the young folks that I work with, it seems like they have that same kind of feeling.
Thank you, James. Thank you. And I would invite Rafi and Max to also weigh in about, what did you need? I agree. If I see a rainbow flag, and I'm fortunate to live in a community where they're, everywhere, along with the Black Lives Matters yard signs and all of that, I feel better and I feel safer. And I feel like everybody else feels safer in a community that's kind of just putting it out there. So I know it's just one thing that needs to happen in a multitude of things that need to happen to create a better world. But Max and Rafi, I wonder if you would, as James just did, weigh in about, what was it that you needed as a young person that you got or maybe didn't get that helped you be who you are? And that'll sort of close us up because we've got only about 3 minutes left. Who wants to go first?
I'll make mine quick. I would love to have a whole nother panel just talking about queer lived experiences, not to be, I'm proud to be very in touch with my vulnerability. So I'm just going to say a string of things that may be a little triggering, but I am a suicide attempt survivor. I am a recovering alcoholic. I am 23 years old and queer. That is ridiculous. You know what I mean? And I am on the privileged side of I can't imagine not having the resources to address that's ridiculous. And my suicide attempt was when I was a high schooler. So I think a whole nother panel needs to be talked about that. And I think that's it. And, I appreciate being here today and having those important discussions. And I look forward to having more.
I look forward to having more too. Thank you for sharing that with us. I appreciate, I'm grateful that you were able to do that in this space. And we will have more conversations. And Rafi, how about you? Something that you got or didn't get as a young person that helped you be who you are?
This is actually my favorite question. So I appreciate that it's how we're capping this, all right? Um, I wish that I knew when I was younger what I know today. And that's that my lived experiences, my identities are not monolithic. So what really messed me up, and I'm trying not to curse because that's how passionate I am about it, right? What really messed me up as a survivor of violence, as someone who's a part of many intersecting identities throughout my community, right? Is that I was getting support from social workers who are taught in social work school about clients that do what's called splitting, right? But I, as a client, wasn't informed that I don't have to split. And what I mean by that is I don't have to go to the Black group to receive Black services. And I don't have to go to the youth program to get youth services. And I don't have to go to the trans medical center to get trans services and go to the gay after school program to get gay services, you know, and the list goes on and on and on. While I benefited from those existing organizations, what happened was that I grew up having an identity crisis. I grew up having a like this weird experience of not knowing, but when do I bring all of me into a space, right? Like there's so many tables, there are so many tables saying I have a seat, but like which table am I going to be my fullness of me? When can I bring all the infinity stones that makes up who I am to the table? Because I don't just want to be Black in the Black space and Latinx in the Latinx space and queer in the queer space. I want to be Rafi. I want to be me. I want to bring all of me here. So I say that to say, you know, keep doing the amazing work that you're all doing to uplift youth within queer spaces and make sure that they're fully aware that they are allowed to bring everything with them.
Mhm. I love that. Thank you so much. That's such a commentary about identity, which I just appreciate so much. And we need to have those conversations more. I wish we could talk for another hour or two, but Max, to your point, we're going to have to do this again, and we will. I'll make that a priority for us here at the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. This last slide is everybody's contact information, as we promised that you would get. You will get this PowerPoint and more. And please reach out to Max or James or Rafi or Jennifer or myself at the coalition. Lots and lots of stuff in the chat. We'll also make sure that we, anything that was shared in there is a link that we put out in the resource links. So I really do wish that we didn't have to cut us off. I want to just honor the time that you've all given us. And thank you so much to our panelists for your candor and your vulnerability, but also your expertise. It's a fantastic conversation. I hope that the participants got a lot out of it. And we'll see you next time. Stay involved, stay engaged, but hey, thank God it's Friday, right? Thank you all very much.